Basically, when it comes to record keeping, there is no perfect formula. So in terms of how, some producers find that keeping clear notes in a diary or a record book works really well. Others keep their records within their farm management software programs and similarly within computer spreadsheets. But regardless of the method, it's important that all the relevant management activities are accurately and clearly recorded and capture the required information. And that's for a couple of reasons, because you need it to fill in your national vendor deck, but you also might need it should you be required to participate in an LPA audit, because your LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor. So it's important to make sure they're accurate and up to date. It's particularly important that producers get records in order well before an audit. An audit is not the time to do this or the only motivation for doing this. Providing lifetime traceability through good record keeping is also a really positive marketing advantage for us. So to make it easier for you, we've created record keeping templates which are aligned to the 7 LPA requirements and outline all the different information that you need to record. Now, these are available at the Integrity System website, and you could search for record keeping template there. So what we might do is might step through each of those templates that are available now against the different criteria. The first thing I'll just talk through very quickly is that you can now upload your record keeping directly to your LPA account. And the benefits of this are that all your records are in the one location. You can retrieve them at any time. You've got easy access for auditing purposes. We've recently created a fact sheet for how you can create or upload documents into your LPA account. They're also available on the ISC website, and check that post-webinar email that we're going to send out in the next day or two for the link. And a bit of an insight there, and you'll see this little I guess infographic that'll pop up throughout this evening's webinar. There's a couple of practical tips there for you, but property risk assessments and farm biosecurity plans, they can be completed entirely digitally now rather than on a printed template, and you can do that directly into the LPA Service Centre. Moving right along. So the different types of records that are required for keeping across the LPA program. There are 2 different types of records. They're, I guess, what we're referring to as property management records. Now, these are something that are often completed and reviewed, say, once a year. It's a good idea to do them once a year. And these are things like the property risk assessment, the biosecurity plan, and that animal welfare certification. The other type of records are more operational records. Now, these are records which are filled out either daily or weekly and can include things like visitor registers for biosecurity, feed and livestock treatment records, commodity vendor decks, national vendor decks, and livestock movements. So as we move into each of the different criteria as part of LPA, we'll now start with the property risk assessment. So for this requirement, you must identify, and so what we're going to do, sorry, for the rest of the webinar is we're going to sort of outline for each of the different requirements why it's important that this requirement exists, and then how do you go about meeting it, and then we'll introduce the template and the types of things that you might need to do for your record keeping to meet each of those requirements. So that's basically how we're going to structure it. So first one we're going to start with is the property risk assessment. So for this requirement, it's all about identifying any possible risk on your property where livestock could come into contact with physical and or chemical contaminants, and how you might develop strategies for how this risk will be managed. So why is this important? Property risk assessments ensure the integrity of the meat we produce, guaranteeing that it is safe and of a high quality. Because if livestock encounter persistent chemicals, for example, such as lead, the meat produced may contain unacceptably high chemical residues, and that therefore impacts on food safety and then market access. Physical contaminants, such as wire, could of course cause harm to animals and people if they become lodged in meat tissue. Now, there's many repercussions of selling livestock with unacceptable levels of persistent chemicals or physical contaminants, but they may include failure to be paid for the livestock, possible legal liability for resulting costs faced by processors and the rest of the supply chain. And in some instances, it can actually impact on international trade. Now, you can meet this LPA requirement by completing a property risk assessment and a map, regularly reviewing and updating it when changes might occur on farm. And then, of course, these documents need to be filed for auditing purposes. Now, on the screen here now, we just have an example of a property risk assessment map that's been developed. And this meets ISC's record keeping requirements, and it's on one of the templates that are available. Now, a risk assessment must be carried out when any changes to the enterprise's current activities occur, such as a change in land use on the property. It requires producers to mark up on a property map such suspect areas such as old yards and dip sites, treated yards, old rubbish dump sites, and of course treated power poles. And you can see those risk areas are marked as examples on the screen there. And on the screen now, we have, this is another example from the ISC's record keeping template example where risks are documented and a description is provided on how the site is managed to eliminate the risk of contamination. You can see there on the screen, the first example is of an old rubbish dump and what that risk might actually present. So the reason that the risk has been identified, any results that might have been received, for example, if you've done soil testing, and that's, I guess, highlighting the specific risk that's presented by the rubbish dump there, and then you provide a description of how the site is managed and what you might do to manage that particular risk. So this is just an example. This is based on the template that we have at ISC. And it basically is just a list. And I mean, by providing these sorts of templates, it just highlights that there's no one size fits all, and you can't, I mean, the risks are going to be very unique to a particular property, for example. The next LPA requirement that we're going to take a look at is biosecurity. Now, as part of the Livestock Production Assurance Program, you must implement on-farm biosecurity systems to minimise the risk of infectious diseases being introduced to livestock production properties and the subsequent spread of those diseases. Now, why is this important? Good biosecurity practices prevent the spread of infectious disease and invasive pests or weeds between farms, as well as protecting Australia from diseases and weeds that occur overseas. Biosecurity procedures address the containment of disease outbreaks when they occur. Now, ensuring your livestock are and remain free from serious infectious diseases allows you to maximise farm productivity and minimise animal discomfort, stock losses and medical costs. Now, to meet this particular LPA requirement, you must have a formal documented farm biosecurity plan. You need to ensure that all livestock movements have a known health status through a livestock health statement or declaration. And you need to ensure that there are systems in place to notify the owner of any unusual disease, illness or mortalities. And you need to keep records of movements of people, vehicles and equipment entering your property where reasonable and practical. Now, some producers may have produced a JBAS or a Yoni's farm biosecurity plan. Now, this actually also meets those LPA biosecurity requirements. So if you have used another program or template to create a biosecurity plan, and there are many available, check that it covers all the required information from the LPA template to ensure that you're compliant with biosecurity requirements for LPA. Now, on the screen here, this is just an example from one of the ISC record keeping templates. It's a formal documented farm biosecurity plan. And this one, like to meet the requirements, must address the following. It must talk to how you manage and record the introduction and movement of livestock in a way that minimises the risk of introducing and or spreading infectious diseases. Where reasonable and practical, control people, equipment and vehicles entering the property, and therefore minimising the potential for property contamination. And prevent and control animal diseases on farm by regularly monitoring and managing livestock movements. Now, the key is to focus here on what's relevant to your farm and your production system. So there certainly is no one size fits all with biosecurity, and it depends on your level of risk and also your risk appetite for how you manage those. It doesn't mean that you need to tick every box on a biosecurity plan template, because certain things won't apply to your situation. The important thing to consider is that what risks apply to your farm and business and how you're going to manage those risks. So for example, here on our property, we're mainly merinos, so very focused on wool production. I also have 7 neighbours of varying sizes. I'm in a peri-urban type of area with a number of small landholders around me. So my biggest issue is managing fences and managing straying stock from neighbours, because I don't want an incursion of lice. Now, for somebody in North Queensland, for example, that would not even be relevant. They might be their biosecurity risks would be completely different. Something here for me, I also have a river going through our property, and so weeds can travel down the river when it's flooded, or we can lose floodgates and things like that. Again, straying stock and certain weeds that are transferred by water is our biggest issue from a biosecurity point of view. But as I said, very unique. And all that the biosecurity plan does is allow you to document how you're going to manage these risks. Because of course, as producers and farmers, we've been managing biosecurity risks for many years. What the biosecurity plan does, and we've also been using a lot of common sense as well. What the biosecurity plan does is enable us to put that in writing and show that we have thought of the risks and we're going to manage those risks. Here's an example on the screen, again from the ISC record keeping templates of a property visitor register that you might like to keep. And again, these are just examples of things that might apply to your situation. Now, in particular, there in Tasmania, the Biosecurity Act in 2019, which came in force in Tasmania, that's a new legal obligation, and it's known as the General Biosecurity Duty, or the GBD. And the GBD, as part of that act, came into effect on the 31st of March this year, so only very recently. Now, the General Biosecurity Duty operates as a statutory duty of care in respect to biosecurity. And what that does is it means that a person, which includes all levels of government, individuals and private corporate entities, has to take all reasonable and practical measures to prevent, eliminate or minimise biosecurity risks. So under the General Biosecurity Duty, any person dealing with plants or animals or their derived products who knows or reasonably ought to know that a biosecurity risk is posed or is likely to be posed has a legal duty to ensure that the risk is prevented, eliminated or minimised so far as is reasonably practicable. Now, the introduction of the GBD does not mean that you now have to know everything about biosecurity. However, you do need to know about biosecurity risks that apply to your specific industry, business, work environment or pastimes, and how to manage or minimise those risks to the best of your ability. So the GBD provides an extra level of biosecurity protection to ensure that all foreseeable biosecurity risks, whether or not they are covered by specific requirements or guidelines, are appropriately managed. A significant breach of the GBD that is intentional or reckless will be treated as an aggravated offence that may carry a significant penalty under the Act. So in very simple terms, because I'm conscious that that was incredibly legal, the GBD reinforces that everyone has a role to play in protecting the unique environment there in Tasmania and primary industries against biosecurity risks. And the tip there is, if you want more information on the General Biosecurity Duty, you can jump onto the DPIPWE website, or if you've got any specific questions, we do have some of the team here on the call this evening. But I guess what that does from we have a biosecurity requirement as part of livestock production assurance that then is being reinforced through state biosecurity legislation as well. So they are seen to be quite complementary. So animal welfare, that's another important requirement of the Livestock Production Assurance Program. Why is it important? Because of course livestock health and wellbeing is really fundamental to the success and sustainability of every farm in Australia. Australian red meat producers should be fully aware of their obligations and take those obligations and responsibilities in caring for animals very seriously. How do we meet the requirement around animal welfare? Well, in particular, producers and LPA accredited producers must have a copy of the standards and guidelines for animal welfare accessible as a reference. The person responsible for the property must have received training in those standards and guidelines through the LPA learning module on animal welfare. And all staff involved in livestock husbandry are familiar with the contents of the standards and guidelines and have been trained in a manner consistent with those guidelines. So the tip there, the Integrity Insight, is to download the standards and guidelines and save it so that all your team members can access it. And that's just at animalwelfarestandards.net.au, but that link will be circulated in the post-webinar email as well. Here on the screen now, we just have an example of the animal welfare certificate that would be generated once you've done the animal welfare learning module as part of your accreditation process. So the next requirement there is around safe and responsible animal treatments. Now, basically here you need to undertake steps to ensure that animal treatments are administered in a safe and responsible manner that minimises the risks of chemical residues and physical hazards to the animals. This is really important because basically our customers expect that livestock are treated responsibly and that the meat we produce is safe. So how do you meet that requirement? You need to document and file all animal treatment details. You should complete a chemical user course. Note when equipment is used for livestock treatment is cleaned. Record authorisation and directions for any off-label use of chemicals from a veterinarian. Note any animals that are exposed to physical contaminants like broken needles when they're being treated. And absolutely you need to mark animals that are treated with HGPs with that triangular ear punch. So the insight there is to keep records for a minimum of 3 years in accordance with state legislation, or for the duration of the livestock being on the pick, whichever is longer. So here on the screen, we've got an example of the ISC record keeping template. And basically it's just there outlining the treatment date, the description, the product trade name, the batch number, the dose rate that was used, the withholding period or the export slaughter interval, the date safe, so the date that the animals come out of the withholding period or the export slaughter interval, and who they were treated by. Now the insight there, or the tip, is that you can also ask your supplier to add the vet product batch number or expiry date and withholding period to the invoice for your treatment record, so you can keep that. And if you don't know what the withholding period or the export slaughter interval is for a particular product, you can visit the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority website, and we'll circulate that link with the information after the webinar. Similarly, this is an example of the chemical inventory record based on our templates that are available. Again, you can ask your supplier to add the AgChem product batch number and expiry date to the invoice when you purchase them. Again, that's really useful for your treatment records when it comes to filling out your templates when you get home. Doesn't mean you've got to go out to the shed then and tip the drum upside down and get the right details off it. Again, you're just capturing information such as the date that you've received the product name, the expiry date or the date of manufacture, whichever you have, the batch number, and who added that to the inventory, and of course making sure that those products are stored correctly as well. So the next LPA requirement is around stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments. Now you must guarantee that animals are not exposed to foods containing chemical contamination. This is really important because exposure to contaminated food may result in unacceptably high chemical residues at the time of slaughter, and of course this poses a risk to human health, trade and the industry's reputation. To meet this requirement, you need to keep records of all ag chemical treatments. You need to document any introduced stock feed. You need to have management systems in place to identify livestock that may have become contaminated. By being able to identify them, you should map or list any treated or contaminated sites as part of your risk assessment, and then you should try and make sure that you source when you're purchasing fodder and keeping all your commodity vendor declarations that accompany any introduced grain or hay products. Here on the screen, we've got an example of a crop pasture and paddock treatment record. So, and these are fairly standard. And as I said earlier, you can get these types of templates even from your farm chemical supplier as well, or your local agronomist. They would all, as long as they're capturing the same sort of information, it doesn't matter what the template is that you use. And here is a grain and fodder treatment record. So again, things like the date of application, the storage ID location, the product that it was treated with, what the treatment rate was, and who it was treated by, and then also capturing information of what the chemical that was used as well. Here's an example of some introduced stock feed records. So again, things like the date, what it was, where it came from, what your commodity vendor deck or equivalent reference number is, so that you can refer to it later on, and whether or not you had any residue analysis completed as part of that, where it's stored, and who on the farm might have been responsible for that. Again, here's just an example of something you might like to use for livestock feeding records. So what was the product, where was it stored, what mob was fed on the property, and then the start and finish dates, and who was responsible on farm for that. Just on commodity vendor decks very quickly, all introduced stock feed should be accompanied by a commodity vendor deck. Now this includes grain and hay and silage. It doesn't apply to commercially manufactured pellets, for example. You don't need to get a CVD. Now, the commodity vendor deck needs to provide details of the chemicals, if there were any used to treat the hay or grain, for example, the rate and date of the chemical application, and whether or not there's any relevant withholding periods or export slaughter intervals or export animal feed intervals that were on that chemical label. Now, just making sure that you realise that commodity vendor decks are a food safety document. They don't, they're not particularly a biosecurity, such as weeds and things like that. They really are only around the whatever chemicals were used to treat that particular product. So the next requirement there is around preparation for dispatch of livestock. You must guarantee that livestock are fit to transport and ensure that they experience minimal stress and contamination during both assembly or getting ready for and transport. This is really important, obviously, because if livestock become stressed, contaminated or injury during assembly for transport or during transport, then they can, of course, pose a food safety risk or a food quality risk as well. But livestock that aren't fit for transport may also be an animal welfare concern and therefore won't meet expectations of our customers. So basically, what you need to do to meet this requirement is to ensure that all livestock are fit to load. Record the transport details, including the vehicle registration and key times. And that, of course, can be done as part of documenting and filing your national vendor decks, and record reports of any animals which may have been exposed to physical contaminants. Great little insight there. Keep a copy handy. It's the fit to load guide. So is the animal fit to load? And that has some great insights in terms of what actually constitutes animals being unfit for transport or presentation at a sale yard. Here's just an example of how you might capture some details of animals being prepared for loading. On the screen there, the types of information that you might want to keep track of. The next requirement is around livestock transactions and movements. You must guarantee that animals sold are not exposed to food safety hazards and meet all traceability requirements. This is really important because recording livestock transfers ensures that animal history is, I guess, known, and then that traceability element follows, and that animal history follows that animal as it moves along the supply chain. How do you meet the requirements as part of this section, you need to record all purchases and sales of animals. You need to keep copies of all your national vendor decks. You need to record the vendor's name, address, and the PIC. You need to record the livestock details and their description. You need to keep records of all animals purchased while within a withholding period or an export slaughter interval. And of course, you need to document animals that may have come in contact with or exposed to physical contaminants. So that's just going through the requirement, but in particular, this one is relevant for the national vendor deck. Now, it's really important when it comes to NVDs that you make sure that they're completed so that they're clear, complete, and correct. That's really the only way that everyone can make sure that they stand by what they sell, because the NVD is the visual part of the integrity system, and that's when all these other things and all this record keeping that you've been done comes to life, I guess. So there's just a couple of sections on the NVD which I did want to touch on very briefly, and that's really in section A, where sometimes we have a little bit of trouble. And that's really where all the questions are about the animal's history. Now, this information is really important for food safety and market access. So it's really important that you stay on the safe side. So if in doubt, you should tick yes, and of course, check those records which you've been keeping. So a couple of things that I would point out there is that if you bred the livestock, you tick yes for that question. If you purchased one or more animals that are in the consignment, then tick no, but it's really important that you then indicate through the most recent date of purchase. And something else that's really important is that sometimes the consigned to and the destination of the animals are different, and they may have different property identification codes or PICs. So it's really important that you identify that on the national vendor deck. And the best example of that is if you're actually sending animals to a sale yard or a selling centre. So if that's the case, the consigned to would typically be your livestock agent, but the destination would actually be the sale yard. So just be careful when you are filling in that particular question on the NVD. The final part of the NVD, of course, is the declaration. Now, just a reminder that when you are making that declaration or when you're signing the NVD, you are guaranteeing that your on-farm practices meet all those LPA requirements that we've talked about, and that you're also ultimately meeting those customer expectations. And of course, those declaration must be backed up by good farm records. We do now have a faster, easier eNVD as an option rather than filling in the hard copy. It's fast, easy, it's more accurate than paper. It ensures that the latest version of the NVD is always being used. Reduces time and duplication spent completing your livestock assurance and health declarations. And it reduces the cost of storing and retrieving them, particularly in the case of an audit or other sort of reporting requirements. And of course, you don't need to wait for a new NVD book to arrive. So just recording those recording your livestock movements through the NLIS, of course, which is also an important part of this requirement. You must record all your livestock movements onto your PIC on the NLIS database to remain LPA accredited. And if a producer is selected to participate in an audit, then the auditor will certainly review whether the transfers for livestock moved onto your PIC have been recorded on the database. And state legislation also requires that the buyer or the receiver of the animals completes the transfer on the NLIS database, and penalties can be imposed by the state or territory government for failing to complete those transfers. So just to be clear that as the receiver of animals, it is your responsibility to make sure that the NLIS transfer has been done. So be particularly careful. Even if you've got a third party, such as a livestock agent or a sale yard doing that transfer for you, it's really important that you double check that that transfer has actually been done. So here's just an example of, I guess, a way that you could summarise your livestock purchases and movement records. So you can either manage it through the NLIS database, or you can just keep a summary record in a template such as this. This is a the reverse. So this is a summary of animals going off the property, for example. So now we move on to audits. We've had a bit of a deep dive into each of those different requirements. I guess our key message here, if you are contacted for an LPA audit, is don't panic. Audits are about identifying areas for practical improvement. It's not about pointing out everything that's been done wrong, but it is a condition of accreditation with the LPA program that you do agree to participate in the audit process. Your LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor, so it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. But as part of the process, they'll certainly give you plenty of tips. Now, at the moment, we are conducting about 3,000 audits per year. So 2,000 of those would be random audits, and up to 1,000 of those might be specifically targeted. The integrity insight there is to keep an eye out for the audit checklist in the notification pack, or if you would like to be a little bit prepared, or just to get a bit of a I guess a oversight of the types of things that might be required, then that's available on our website as well. Now, what actually happens if issues are identified during the audit process? Well, if the issue is something quite minor, then the auditor may record what's called an observation, which means that as the producer or the LPA accredited account holder, you need to consider taking some action to improve that particular practice. Now, this might be such as not obtaining a commodity vendor deck for purchase fodder, or not correctly completing an NVD, where the destination or consigned have different addresses and this hasn't been correctly filled in. However, if the issue is more significant, then the auditor may raise what's called a corrective action request, or a CAR. Now, this means that the producer needs to actually take action to ensure that compliance is maintained with those requirements, and you then need to submit that evidence in order to close out that corrective action. Now, a common corrective action is where there's no biosecurity plan in place, or where there's discrepancies between the NVDs and the NLIS transfers on the NLIS database. So something like an NLIS transfer does not correlate with the NVD records for the PIC, or the number of active NLIS devices assigned to that particular property on the database doesn't reflect the number of livestock or tags that are actually currently active on the PIC. Now, CARs can be, or corrective actions can be managed by emailing the evidence directly to the auditor, or you can upload the evidence now directly to your LPA account, and that's a recently added feature to the LPA service centre, and you can see that on the screen there, where the corrective action was raised in an audit. You can respond to that, and then that can be addressed and rectified as part of that process. All online in your account. So just to close out, I guess we've taken you through a bit of a summary of each of the LPA requirements and how it is that you can go about meeting those requirements, but then also some ideas around record keeping. We do have plenty more information. The ISC has a great website now where you can go into those individual LPA program requirements in more detail, and as part of that you can access all the templates required to assist you with your record keeping. And then you can also, as I said earlier, you can actually do online record keeping now as part of the LPA service centre, and the biosecurity plan and the property risk assessment can actually be done from scratch within that system, or you can upload documents directly to the platform as well.